I bought a forgotten strip of dirt for $2,900, and by the end of the month, a room full of wealthy homeowners was staring at me like I had just stolen the sun out of the sky. The funny thing is, they were the ones who had been using it for almost 20 years without owning it. And the only reason anybody found out was because I opened a steel door everyone else had spent years pretending did not exist. My name is Nolan Pierce, and before all this happened, I was not the kind of man who ended up in neighborhood meetings with attorneys whispering in the back row and retired doctors calling me a criminal under their breath. I was just an electrical contractor living outside Fair Lake, Oregon, in a little one-story house with a sagging back porch, 2 rescue dogs, and a garage so packed with wire spools, breaker boxes, and old conduit that my wife, Marcy, said it looked like a power company exploded in there. She used to tease me because I could drive past a subdivision and tell you where the service lines probably came in before I could tell you what color the houses were. That was just how my brain worked. Some men noticed trucks, some noticed lawns. I noticed transformers humming behind shrubs. So when a man named Warren Bellamy called me one Tuesday afternoon and said he had a small piece of land I might want to take off his hands, I should have hung up right there. Because Warren did not call people like me unless he needed something cleaned up without leaving his fingerprints on it. Warren was one of those polished local men who always seemed to be standing in front of a flag, a podium, or a catered table. Former real estate attorney, former developer, former board chair at Hawthorne Preserve, which was the fanciest HOA community in our county. He wore loafers that cost more than my first truck and had a talent for making insults sound like compliments. He had hired me twice over the years for electrical work, and both times he called me Nathan. My name was on the invoice, big letters. Still, Nathan, when he called about the land, it was warm in that fake business way. The kind of warm where you can almost hear the smile being stapled onto his face. He said, "Nolan, I remembered you do some utility work. I thought maybe this parcel might interest you, though honestly, it is not much." I asked him where it was. He said it sat behind Hawthorne Preserve, back past the pickleball courts and the stormwater pond, a skinny old maintenance parcel the association never cared about. Then he laughed and said, "If I am being blunt, it is practically useless. Now I have learned in life that when a man with 3 degrees and a boat tells you something is useless, what he usually means is, I need you to believe it is useless before you look too closely. Still, curiosity gets me in trouble. Always has. So I drove out there 2 days later after finishing a job at a feed store. Hawthorne Preserve looked exactly like the brochure promised. All stone entrance signs, fresh mulch, white trim, perfect lawns, little flags by the mailboxes. The kind of place where even the speed bumps looked expensive. Warren met me near the back gate wearing a navy blazer in 78-degree weather, which told me everything I needed to know about his relationship with comfort. He walked me down a narrow service path behind the recreation area, talking the whole time about how the parcel had been carved out years ago and nobody had any real use for it. It was maybe 25 feet wide and 30 feet deep, boxed in by a chain-link maintenance fence. Dry weeds, cracked ground, nothing pretty. But sitting right in the middle of it was a square concrete structure, beige, windowless, about the size of a small shed, with a steel door and a low humming sound coming from inside. I stopped walking when I heard it. Warren kept talking for another few steps before he realized I was not beside him anymore. He turned back and said, "Oh, that old thing. Just utility equipment. Standard stuff. Nothing you need to worry about." That was the first moment my stomach gave me a little tug. Not fear exactly. More like the feeling you get when a breaker panel is labeled too neatly by somebody who does not want you tracing the wires. I asked who serviced it. Warren waved a hand like he was brushing away a fly. "Contractors, mostly. The HOA handles all that." I said, "But the structure sits on the parcel." He smiled. And I remember this clearly because it was the smile of a man trying to close a drawer before you see what is inside. Technically, yes. But these little utility arrangements are everywhere, Nolan. Nobody makes a fuss over them. Then he pulled out a folder. He already had the documents tabbed, yellow stickers on every signature line. I almost laughed because the man had prepared paperwork for a supposedly worthless piece of dirt like he was selling me a kidney. He said it was all very simple, just standard language, nothing unusual. And then he added, "Most buyers do not bother with those easement sections anyway." That sentence stayed with me. Not because it was shocking, but because it was too casual. My father poured concrete for 36 years, and he had one rule that applied to everything from mortgages to sandwich receipts. Read it before you sign it. because the part that costs you money is never the part they point to. So I sat on the tailgate of my truck and started reading. Warren checked his watch after 3 minutes. After 10, he stopped smiling. After 15, he said he had another appointment and suggested I take the packet home. I said that was exactly what I planned to do. That night, Marcy found me at the kitchen table with the papers spread out between a cold cup of coffee and a plate of reheated meatloaf. She kissed the top of my head and asked if I had bought another broken generator off Craigslist. I told her, not yet, but I might buy a problem with a fence around it. She rolled her eyes. Because being married to me means hearing sentences like that and deciding not to ask too many questions before bed. For 3 nights, I read through the purchase agreement, county notes, old references, survey attachments. Everything Warren had handed me. Nothing screamed fraud. Nothing jumped off the page and said, "Congratulations, you have found the stupidest legal mistake in Oregon." But the utility language was mushy. That is the only word for it. Mushy. It talked about facilities, access, maintenance expectations, continued use. All these soft little phrases that sounded official until you asked one simple question: who owns what? And every time I asked that question, the paperwork got quiet. A smarter man might have walked away. A richer man might have hired a lawyer first. Me, I let my curiosity win, paid cash, and signed the deed a week later. Warren shook my hand so hard you would have thought I had done him a personal favor. He looked relieved. Not happy, not satisfied, relieved. At the time I told myself he was just glad to unload a useless scrap of land. That was the lie I chose because it made the day easier. The next morning I drove back with my tool bag, a flashlight, and a ring of old keys Warren had included in the sale. The air was cool, the grass was wet, and Hawthorne Preserve was quiet except for a leaf blower whining somewhere beyond the tennis courts. I stood in front of that concrete box for a long second, listening to the hum behind the door. I was not trying to start a war. I was not trying to embarrass a board or squeeze money out of retirees or become the villain in somebody's HOA newsletter. I was just a tradesman, standing on land I legally owned, looking at a locked door that now belonged to me. The third key turned. The door stuck at first, then gave with a metal groan that sounded louder than it should have in the morning stillness. I pulled it open, swept my flashlight across the room, and for about 5 seconds, my brain refused to accept what my eyes were seeing. This was not some little junction box. Inside were transformer cabinets, breaker panels, water control equipment, emergency shutoffs, labeled conduits, and rows of circuits running out in every direction like veins under skin. I stepped inside slowly, the way you step into a room where you suddenly realize everybody else has been lying about what is in there. The labels were old but clear. Pool pumps, clubhouse kitchen, east gate lighting, west gate lighting, building 1, building 2, irrigation main, common area service. I read them twice. Then I read them again, slower. By the time I traced the first outgoing feed through the conduit bank, the truth hit me so hard I actually laughed. Just once. Because there are moments in life so ridiculous your body does not know whether to panic or make a joke. Nearly every major utility control for Hawthorne Preserve was sitting inside a concrete building on my $2,900 piece of dirt, and unless the paperwork was hiding something I had not found yet, those people did not have a legal right to be there. The first thing I did was stand there like an idiot with my flashlight in my hand, because there are discoveries you celebrate, and then there are discoveries that make you wish you had brought a lawyer instead of a tool bag. The hum in that little concrete room suddenly sounded different, heavier somehow, like the whole neighborhood was breathing through equipment bolted to my floor. I remember backing out, closing the steel door, and just standing in the weeds for a minute while a golden retriever barked somewhere beyond the fence, and a woman in yoga pants walked past the pond without the slightest idea that her entire streetlight system might be depending on a door I had just opened. I did not touch anything. I did not flip a breaker. I did not even tighten a loose screw. And if you know electricians, you know how much self-control that took. I drove home, put the keys in a coffee mug on the kitchen counter, and told Marcy, I think I bought the nerve center of a rich neighborhood. She stared at me over her cereal and said, "Please tell me this is one of those sentences that sounds worse than it is." I said, "I'm afraid it might be exactly as bad as it sounds." For the next 10 days, my life turned into paper. County records, old plats, planning commission minutes, utility maps, subdivision approvals, scanned deeds from the early 2000s that looked like they had been copied through a screen door. I went through all of it. I made calls during lunch breaks from parking lots. I emailed clerks who probably started recognizing my name and sighing before they opened the message. Every night, Marcy would find me at the table with documents spread around me in little piles, one for what made sense, one for what did not, and one pile I started calling the How in God's Name pile. That third pile got big fast. Hawthorne Preserve had been built 19 years earlier, right in the middle of that housing rush when everyone thought every cow pasture in America needed granite countertops and a walking trail. The original developer had put in the roads, lighting, clubhouse, pool, irrigation, gates, all the shiny stuff people buy into when they want order and quiet and the ability to find their neighbors for garbage cans. Somewhere in that process, this tiny utility parcel got carved out separately. Maybe by mistake, maybe because a survey changed. Maybe because somebody was moving too fast and nobody wanted to slow down the money machine. But after the home sold, nobody fixed it. Not the developer, not the closing attorneys, not the HOA board, not Warren Bellamy, who'd been board chair twice and had signed his name on enough association documents to wallpaper my garage. What I could not find was the thing that mattered most. No permanent easement, no lease, no maintenance agreement, no recorded right of access that gave Hawthorne Preserve the legal authority to occupy that parcel forever. There were references to expected utility use, little breadcrumbs in memos and meeting notes, but nothing with teeth. After the fourth night of squinting at old scans, Marcy finally put her hand over my laptop and said, "Nolan, either call someone who understands this or admit you are enjoying it too much." She was right on both counts. I hired a title researcher named Carla Mendez, a woman with a dry voice and a talent for making county archives sound like crime scenes. She told me she would pull the chain of title, check recorded easements, look for old agreements, the whole works. I figured she would find the missing document in an hour, and I would feel foolish. 4 days later, she called while I was replacing lights in a dentist's office. I stepped outside, still wearing my tool belt, and she said, "Mr. Haw, Pierce, I checked it 3 different ways." I leaned against the brick wall and waited. She said, "If there is a recorded easement giving them permanent rights to that parcel, it is hiding better than any document I have ever seen." I asked her what that meant in plain English. She paused, then said, "In plain English, you own the land, and their infrastructure appears to be sitting on it because everybody assumed somebody else had handled the paperwork." That sentence stayed with me because it summed up half the disasters in adult life. Everybody assumed somebody else handled it. The next step was a survey. I hired a boundary guy named Roy Satterfield, who had skinned my boot leather, a truck full of orange steaks, and the personality of a man who trusted measurements more than people. Roy spent 2 full days out there shooting lines, checking corners, comparing old plats with current markers, muttering to himself whenever Hawthorne residents slowed their golf carts to stare at him. On the 3rd afternoon, he handed me a folded map and said, "Well, if they wanted that building on association property, they messed." I unfolded it on the hood of his truck. The concrete structure, the conduit bank, the access pad, every inch of it sat inside my boundary. No overlap, no gray area, no little sliver they could point to and say, "Gotcha, just mine." That was when the curiosity drained out and the weight of it settled in. It is one thing to suspect you're holding a strange card. It is another thing to realize the card might set the whole table on fire. I called an attorney named Grace Hollis, who had helped a friend of mine with a commercial lease dispute and had the kind of calm voice that makes nervous people sit up straighter. I brought her the title report, the survey, the sale documents, photographs of the equipment, and a notebook full of my own observations, which she politely pretended were organized. Grace read for a long time without saying much. Then she took off her glasses, looked at me, and said, "Does the HOA know how exposed they are?" I said, "Warren probably knows enough to be sweating." She smiled a little, not happy, not cruel, just professional. "Then we should give them a chance to sweat in writing." The letter she drafted was beautiful in the most boring way possible. No threats, no insults, no dramatic language, just facts lined up like fence posts. Critical utility infrastructure serving Hawthorne Preserve was located on privately owned land. Our search had not found recorded documentation granting permanent rights of occupancy or access. The association needed to resolve the issue through removal, relocation, lease or purchase within 30 days. Until then, I expected no unauthorized entry except for emergency safety needs, and I would not interfere with ongoing utility service. Grace sent its certified mail to the board, the property manager, and Warren, because sometimes you want everyone to hear the same thunder at the same time. 4 days later, Warren called. I was in my driveway loading conduit into the van when his name popped up on my phone. I let it ring twice, mostly because I am human. When I answered, his voice had lost that country club polish. "Nolan," he said, "I think there has been a misunderstanding." I looked at the van, at the conduit, at my own dirty boots, and said, "Which part?" He breathed through his nose. "These arrangements are common. Nobody is disputing your little parcel." I almost laughed at little parcel, because men like Warren love making things smaller with words when the facts are getting too big. I said, "That is good, because the county does not seem to be disputing it either." His tone tightened. "You need to be very careful here. If utilities are disrupted, families will be affected." I said, "Warren, I have not disrupted anything. I opened a door on land you sold me." That silence was the first honest thing he gave me. Then he said, "You cannot seriously think you can hold an entire community hostage." I said, "I think an entire community should probably know why its utility controls are sitting on private land without paperwork." He hung up first, which I appreciated because it saved me the trouble. After that, the letters started. HOA Council wrote that the association had long-standing expectations. Grace replied that expectations were not recorded property rights. They wrote about hardship. She wrote about ownership. They wrote about historical use. She wrote about documentation. They wrote that my position was unreasonable. She attached the survey again, probably just to be mean in the quiet lawyer way. Meanwhile, Hawthorne Preserve kept functioning because I did nothing to stop it. The lights stayed on, the pool pumps ran, the gates opened. The sprinklers kept misting those perfect lawns at 6 in the morning like nothing was wrong. But something had changed. I had changed. Every time I drove past that back fence, I realized strangers had access to my property whenever they felt like it. Contractors, maintenance crews, board members, maybe Warren himself. And they had enjoyed that comfort because nobody ever expected the new owner to ask permission. Grace told me I had the right to secure the parcel as long as I did not damage equipment or block emergency access. So I hired a fencing crew and had them install a clean 8-foot black security fence around the lot, with a lockbox for documented emergency access and a plain sign that read, "Private property, access by authorization only." I thought it looked professional. Hawthorne Preserve thought it looked like the start of the apocalypse. Within 48 hours, their neighborhood message board lit up so hard Marcy started reading posts aloud at dinner, like bedtime stories for angry adults. "Who is this, ma'am? Why is there a fence around our utility building? Can he shut off the pool? Is this even legal?" Someone called me a land pirate, which honestly had more flair than I expected from an HOA community. But then the questions shifted, and that was the part Warren should have feared. People stopped asking who I was and started asking who had let this happen. One retired engineer posted a long explanation of why infrastructure ownership matters. A woman from Building 4 asked why she had paid assessments for 12 years when the board apparently did not control the land under the equipment. Then someone posted an old photo of Warren cutting the ribbon at the clubhouse grand opening, smiling beside the very service road that led to my parcel. 2 days later, Warren showed up in person. No blazer this time, just a wrinkled shirt, an old sedan parked crooked by the service path, and a face that looked like sleep had become a rumor. We stood by the fence with the transformer humming behind us. For a while, neither of us said anything. Then he rubbed his forehead and said, "Nolan, let us be reasonable." I said, "I am being reasonable. I hired a lawyer before I touched anything." He looked at the sign like it had personally insulted his ancestors. "These residents are scared." I said, "They should be. Not of me, Warren. Of whoever told them everything was handled." His jaw moved, but no words came out. Then he said, "Nobody thought this would become an issue." And there it was. Not a confession exactly, but close enough to cast a shadow. I stepped closer to the fence and said, "Nobody thought I would read the records." His eyes flicked up to mine, and for 1 second the polished man disappeared, and all I saw was somebody who had spent years trusting that confidence would cover the holes. I handed him Grace's proposed framework through the gate. Purchase option, back use compensation, temporary access terms, liability releases, recorded protections, a requirement that any future board disclose infrastructure ownership in annual reports. Warren flicked through it, and the farther he read, the paler he got. He looked up and said, "They will never approve this." I shrugged, and I did not enjoy it as much as I thought I might. "Then they can move the equipment." He stared at me like I had suggested moving a mountain. Maybe I had. That evening, Hawthorne Preserve announced an emergency community meeting for the following Thursday. and by then everyone knew the little parcel was not little anymore. By Thursday night, the emergency meeting had turned into the hottest ticket in Hawthorne Preserve, which was funny in a grim kind of way because these were people who normally needed 3 reminder emails to show up for a landscaping vote. The clubhouse parking lot was full when I arrived, and the room inside had that thick, nervous energy you feel before a storm. All folded arms, tight mouths, perfume, coffee, and legal pads. Grace walked in beside me with one slim folder and the calm expression of somebody who had already read the ending. I, on the other hand, looked like a man who had spent the day pulling wire through a restaurant ceiling, because that is exactly what I had done. I wore clean jeans, work boots, and a button-down Marcy had ironed while telling me not to let rich people make me feel guilty for owning my own property. That was her whole speech. Very short, very effective. When I stepped into the room, conversations dipped for half a second, then came back louder, and I could feel people sizing me up. Some expected a slick investor. Some expected a villain. Some probably expected horns. Instead, they got me, a tired contractor with drywall dust still under one fingernail, standing next to a lawyer who looked like she could silence a room by blinking. Warren sat at the front table with the current board, and I almost did not recognize him. He had aged 10 years in a week. The board president, a woman named Linda Sharp, opened with a statement about unity, cooperation, and shared values, all the soft cotton words people use when they are trying to wrap a brick. Nobody wanted cotton. A man in the third row stood up before she finished and said, "How did our utilities end up on land we do not own?" The room went quiet so fast you could hear the ice machine kick on in the kitchenette. Linda looked at Warren. Warren looked at his hands. Then a woman near the aisle, maybe in her 70s, with white hair and a voice sharp enough to cut tape, asked, "Who knew?" That was the question. Not what do we pay? Not can we sue? Who knew? Warren lifted his head slowly and said the records were complex, the development history was old, and past assumptions had been made in good faith. It was a beautiful sentence if you enjoy sentences that say absolutely nothing. The white-haired woman said, "I asked who knew, Mr. Bellamy." For the first time since I had met him, Warren did not have a polished answer ready. Grace stood then, not dramatically, just enough to take control of the air, and she explained our position in plain English. I had purchased the parcel legally. The infrastructure was on that parcel. No recorded permanent easement had been found. I had not interfered with service, had not threatened residents, and had offered the association multiple paths to solve the problem permanently. She laid out the options. Purchase the land and record proper protections. Lease it under strict access and liability terms. Relocate the equipment if they believe that was cheaper. The last option made half the room wince because even people who did not know transformers knew moving the guts of a community was not like moving patio furniture. Then came the money. You could feel the temperature change. Grace explained compensation for past unauthorized use, purchase price, legal releases, recording costs, and future governance requirements. A heavy man in a golf shirt jumped up and said, "This is extortion." He pointed at me like we were on daytime television. This man bought a useless lot and now he's shaking us down. I opened my mouth, but Grace was faster. She folded her hands and said, "Extortion is demanding payment without a legal right. Property ownership is not extortion, sir. It is the basis of every home in this room." That landed harder than shouting on her. The man sat down red-faced, and for the first time, some people stopped looking at me and started looking at the board. That was when the room flipped. A younger couple asked why title reviews had not been done when the HOA took over from the developer. A retired accountant asked why reserve funds had been spent on decorative gates before infrastructure ownership was verified. Someone else asked why Warren had sold the parcel to me if it was so harmless. Warren said the parcel had no practical community use. A resident laughed, an ugly little laugh, and said except running the pool, lights, clubhouse, gates, and irrigation. After that, it was not a meeting anymore. It was a reckoning. People were angry, but the anger moved past me like weather moving down a road. I was still part of the storm, sure, but I was no longer the cloud that had caused it. Near the end, Linda asked me directly, "Mr. Pierce, would you have accepted less if we had come to you before the fence?" It was a fair question, and the room waited. I looked at Warren, then back at her, and said, "Maybe," but nobody came to me. You sent letters telling me my rights were inconvenient. You let residents think I was threatening their homes. And before any of that, Mr. Bellamy sold me the parcel while acting like a worthless. I did not create the leverage. I found it sitting in a concrete box. Nobody clapped. I'm glad they did not. This was not that kind of moment. The board went into executive session while the rest of us waited in the lobby, and that might have been the strangest 40 minutes of my life. A few residents avoided me like I had a contagious lawsuit. A few came over quietly. One man said he still did not like the number, but admitted he would not give away land either. The white-haired woman shook my hand and said, "Young man, you have made our board very uncomfortable." And frankly, it was overdue. When the board came back, Linda looked exhausted. The vote was unanimous. Hawthorne Preserve would purchase the parcel, pay the negotiated compensation, record permanent ownership and access documents, adopt annual infrastructure audits, and issue a written acknowledgement to the community explaining what had happened. Warren did not look up during the vote. 32 days later, the money cleared, the deed transferred, and that little strip of dirt was no longer mine. People ask if I felt victorious. The honest answer is no. I felt relieved. I felt tired. I felt a little sad that something so obvious had taken 19 years. 4 lawyers, a fence, and a room full of angry homeowners to fix. Warren resigned from every committee the following week. No farewell speech, no apology tour. Just a 2-line email and a quiet exit from the kingdom he had spent years polishing. Life went back to normal after that. I went back to breaker panels, service calls, bad attic wiring, and Marcy joking that I should never be allowed me suspicious real estate again without adult supervision. But I kept 2 things in my office: a copy of the deed, and the letter Hawthorne Preserve sent admitting the oversight, not because I want to brag, but because they remind me how often power is just confidence wearing a nice jacket, and how often regular people give up their leverage because someone important tells them not to look too closely. So here's the question I still cannot answer cleanly. Was I right to make them pay for a mistake they ignored for almost 20 years? Or should I have handed over the land once I realized families depended on what was sitting there? If you were in my boots, with that deed in your hand and a whole HOA acting like your rights were a nuisance, what would you have done? Would you negotiate, walk away, demand more, accept less, or drag every name into court? Drop your answer in the comments, because stories like this are not just about land or money. They are about responsibility, pride, and the uncomfortable moment when the paperwork finally tells the truth.